Talked a lot about ideas affecting developments in AP World History, and we're going to talk about Marxism today, which is both a theory and an ideology. Remember, a theory attempts to explain the world, and an ideology is an action-oriented system of belief. Marxism is both. It's articulated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in response to the Industrial Revolution. It's articulated in the 19th century. Karl Marx's works, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, inspired the foundation of many communist regimes in the 20th century. The first communist regime begins in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. Karl Marx never sees communism come to fruition in his lifetime. This is an image of Karl Marx's grave in the United Kingdom. It's been vandalized in the image. To be frank, I think the vandalization is unfair. I think the person who vandalized Karl Marx's grave reduced Karl Marx to this kind of boogeyman that inspired and allowed for the establishment of repressive um, regimes in the 20th century. Obviously, communist economics is highly inefficient, and we found that out. We talked about that at the end of Unit 9. And the governments that accompanied communist economics or established communist economics were often very repressive, but laying the onus or the blame on Karl Marx when Marx was trying to create a theory of history, explain historical developments, etc. And when Marx is also still seen as one of the or as launching one of the best critiques of capitalism to this day, I think that vandalization is unfair. So, what influenced Marx's thinking? Well, first, Darwin, the author of The Origins of Species and the scientist that developed the theory of natural selection or evolution by natural selection. Marx, and we'll talk about this in a minute, views history as a series of evolutionary stages. Marx obviously lived after the Industrial Revolution and seeing the deplorable working conditions in the Industrial Revolution and deplorable life expectancy. Marx obviously wrote what he wrote in response to that. And then the Enlightenment. Marx was an Enlightenment thinker, so all of those are you can interpret as influences, big influences on Karl Marx. So if you're going to memorize the definition of Marxism, this is your slide. Bullet 2 is Marx's theory in brief. We'll talk and break down those fancy-looking words, base, superstructure in a bit. Long story short, Marx saw economics as the main force in explaining historical change. Marx predicted the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Contrary to popular belief, he didn't just want to replace and install communism all around the world. He thought capitalism was a necessary stage in the development of human societies that would eventually lead to communism. Just a refresher, capitalism is the private or the means of production are owned privately, and communism is the means of production are owned publicly. Under a communist society, in theory, if everybody owns the means of production, everybody should be equal. So, for example, if no one is a factory owner and everyone owns the factory, everyone reaps the benefits of ownership of that factory, of the production of certain goods and services in that factory. Communist states, in theory, highly value equality. So Marx, based on the second bullet point, if he would have stopped there, then he would have just been a theorist, but he was also an ideologue. He famously articulates in a piece called The 11th Thesis on Feuerbach, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The task is to change it. So Marx's tool for understanding history was the dialectic. So Marxism talks about history being a series of stages, but Marx makes the point that it's a series of fits and starts. He adopts this idea of the dialectic, which is this famous philosophical idea that Hegel articulates and other philosophers articulate, but we're going down a rabbit hole. So let's try to keep straight, Mr. Diaz. So basically, history has an endpoint. It proceeds in a direction. There's a goal to history, and there are a series of stages. But it's by no means the way those stages occur is through this process of a dialectic. So at first, there's a thesis, and there's an antithesis, and then there's a synthesis. Um, so one way to think about this is that the synthesis is basically a middle ground between two extremes. And eventually that synthesis becomes a thesis, and then there's an antithesis to that, and then there's the middle ground again. And you can see that there's almost a staircase in progression um, towards an absolute goal, according to Marxism. So one way you can, I guess, think of the dialectic is maybe in terms of contemporary American politics. It is true that American politics is becoming more liberal. So maybe we think that eventually the American political system is going to be really, really far to the left, and there will be maybe President Bernie Sanders one day. This doesn't just happen overnight. There is a thesis. So maybe that thesis is President Barack Obama, who's a lot more to the left than President Bill Clinton is, maybe. And the next stage doesn't happen right away, right? We don't get a suddenly more left wing president after President Obama. We get an antithesis, right? We get President Trump. And President Trump is a much, much further to the right, I guess, candidate, very unconventional candidate. He's an antithesis. And then maybe people don't like President Trump, and then there's a synthesis, right? And maybe that synthesis comes in the form of Joe Biden. And maybe Joe Biden's administration is more liberal and left wing than President Obama's administration. And then we get another antithesis. Maybe it's another president, but then the synthesis is still more left wing president than Joe Biden. So if I believed that history or um, that there was a dialectical process at play with an endpoint, and that endpoint being um, a you know a President Bernie Sanders type, or maybe a President Ocasio Cortez type. That's the endpoint that I choose. If I believe a dialectical process is the means that we get there, I don't think that it's going to be a series of much more liberal presidents. I also can see that there will be a conservative president, and then a liberal president, and then a conservative, and stuff like that. Another way you can. Next thing we're going to talk about, which is foundational to Marxist theory, is materialism. So Marx was highly inspired by Hegel, who's another German philosopher, and Hegel, but he does an inversion of Hegel's idealism. So Hegel believes that our thoughts and ideas and ideologies determine the material world. We're not going to get into that now because this is in a philosophy class. But Marx says that the material world determines our ideas. And by material world, Marx is really talking about the means of production, right? Land, resources, and the relations of production. What's the relationship? Is there a bourgeois class that's very expansive? Is it a feudal society? Is it a highly industrialized capitalist society? That material world, right? That material world um, creates ideas. It shapes and maintains ideas. And what do I mean by this? So, one of the things that Marx said was that religion was the opium of the masses, right? So, he thought religion was this um, both this crutch that made oppressive relationships of production, economic relationships of production, um, livable, right? If you're living on less than $1 a day, maybe you want to believe in a higher good and a higher power, right? Um, and so that crutch of religion would be part of the superstructure, right? Because the relations of production allows that idea to come into being, right? Because in some way it legitimates and gives the base or the material world meaning. Meaning. Another thing is law and politics. In the present sense, there's all this talk about politicians being bought, and we're going to get to that point when we get to the so what and Marxism and Marxist critiques that we could make in today's world at the end of this video. But um, there's something to be said about like the material world, um, the means of production, the relations of production, influencing and creating politics, right? And different political systems, right? Maybe an authoritarian political system where there's the divine right of kings to flat out put down anybody that dare challenge the way the world works, right? The way the material world works. Um, Maybe as history proceeds in a series of fits and starts, it's a democracy, right? Um, that the material world um, um, gives construction to. And so the base and the superstructure both influence each other, right? In Marxist theory, the base and the superstructure both influence each other, and they're not static, right? It's a very dynamic theory. Marxist theory is very dynamic. Like I said, he believes there are a series of stages in history. So Marxist theory, finally, the last aspect that I'll talk about, we talked about dialectic, materialism, and now we're going to talk about theology. Marxist theory was teleological. And what does teleological mean? It means you think that we are moving towards a definite goal and an end. And for Marx, history has a meaning and a purpose, an end state. And he thought that end state was communism. There are some teleological religions, for example, Christianity, which a lot of my students practice and a lot of colleagues and potentially myself, right? I don't want to give myself away. Practice is a teleological religion. There's a belief that there is an end goal, right? There's a series of events that are recorded that happened in the Bible, and then the second coming of Christ is the end point, right? The Messiah will return again. That's an example of teleology. There's another example. Remember, we talked about when we finished talking about before spring break, at the end of Unit 8, there was a belief that democratic capitalism was now the would now become universal and spread across the world. And there was this famous political scientist at Stanford University, Francis Fukuyama, that wrote the book The End of History because he thought that democratic capitalism would just spread. That's an example of a teleological belief. So let's start bringing this all together. So Marx thought that there were a series of stages of history that came into being through a dialectic. The dialectic meaning the thesis and the antithesis, and then there being a synthesis, and that synthesis being a stage of history. The last stage of history he thought was communism. Marx, contrary to what a lot might believe, did not believe that societies should skip the capitalist phase. He thought capitalism was a necessary phase in the process, but it would create vast inequality, um, great misery, etc., which we'll talk about in the next slide, and that people would inevitably replace it with a classless, fully equal, where the everybody owned the means of production society in communism. So everyone owning the means of production precluded people to make much more profit and exploit other people than others, right? If there's no longer one single factory owner, inequality. If the means of production are owned in the state, in theory there should be an egalitarian society. How does the Bayesian superstructure come in? For right now, because we're not trying to be philosophers, the Bayesian superstructure come in because if the means of production and the relations of production changes, then that means the superstructure changes. It means stuff like religion changes. That means stuff like politics will change, law, art, that will all change as well. And that itself changing, accelerates this process of social change. So why did Marx think capitalism was doomed? He thought that wealthy capitalists would invest in capital, which for our purposes you can just think of like technology instead of people. So like tractors would be an example of capital. And another example of capital would be land. So capitalists would realize that there would get a lot more bang out of their buck if they invested in technology, and industrialists would just invest in technology, not in people, and unemployment would therefore soar. Um, you can see that in the second image, right? Everybody is well aware of automation. So for wealthy capitalists, like in the owner and CEO of Walmart, it's much easier to replace, people with machines, so cashiers with machines. It's much more cost efficient. It brings down costs, etc. But at the same time, too, those people are now unemployed. Those cashiers are now unemployed. So maybe Marx does have a lot to still say about the modern world we live in. So we gave a famous the division of labor may be too extreme. That's another example. So for example, we gave that famous example of a pencil, right? So what allows um, you know capitalism to produce so many pencils and therefore enhance the welfare of so many people in a lot of ways is the division of labor. So no one really knows how to make a single pencil. Tasking one person with making a single pencil would be very inefficient and take forever. But someone's in charge of the graphite, someone's in charge of the eraser, someone's in charge of the paint, and then there's a series of capital machines capital intensive technology that helps accelerate the process itself. Well, think about your life. Marx said, the person in charge of putting the eraser on the pencil over and over and over again is just going to get bored. That's such a horrible way to live, is what Marx would say. Marx also said it led to like the commodification of our lives. Um, so So commodification is usually a negative word. You can see that political cartoon of a person putting or making cows, land, the sky a commodity. So it's a process of turning something into a commodity, making it commercial, right? And it's usually a pejorative. Um, we see a lot of the dystopian works of art, maybe literature or film, that focuses a lot on the impossibility of a utopian society and like how dystopian it could be. So maybe that's a critique of communism, right? If everyone is equal and everyone elevated to that same status, is it really just a sharing of miseries? But I would also say that there's a lot of dystopian literature and film that focuses on commodification, and it's more a critique of on capitalism. So, for example, this is just the first thing to come to mind. I actually did not like Maniac. It's a Netflix series, and I don't recommend you watch it. But it focuses a lot on commodification. So, for example, people sell themselves to be used in pharmaceutical trials, which is actually still very much part of the world we live in today. And they're seen as mere commodities. They're dehumanized by the pharmaceutical company in question, right? They're undertaking very risky trials of drugs that may be damaging to their life and well-being, and it's very dehumanizing, right? So a Marxist would say this is a prime example of something that uh, uncontrolled or unchecked capitalism leads to, right? This is what it's going to lead to. Also, in the movie, you can buy friendships. So maybe something that had no commercial value becomes commodified. Um, it's commodification at play in the movie Maniac. You can buy a friendship, and you can tell that person who you purchase your friendship from to show up and give them a bio of how you want them to interact with you, etc. That's commodification. And Marx, I mean, that's extreme version of commodification, but Marx observed that and said that capitalism would allow that to become uncontrolled. And I think that's a legitimate critique. Marx would also say that capitalism was dehumanizing. That's related to commodification, the division of labor, etc. Capitalism is very much a system, an economic system where the means of production are located in private hands, and a system that is um, predicated on profits is inherently dehumanizing to Marx. So that's why Marx thought capitalism was doomed. Of course, um, it's easy to say that Marx was entirely wrong. And, Marxist theory is very problematic for a variety of different academic reasons that I'm not going to go into here. Um, you know, the communist systems that it gave rise to were highly inefficient. Um, but I think Marx is still important because we don't know if the economic system that we have today is sustainable, right? And we've had politicians, whether it be Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, criticizing um, the federal government, for instance, for being bought out, being corrupted by wealthy capitalists, right? They might not use that language explicitly, but 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 definitely corrupted by wealthy capitalists, corrupted by major corporations buying elections, etc. Also, wealth and income inequality, which Marx said capitalism would produce, is um, destabilizing. It's much larger than people think. There was one there was one Oxfam report that noted that the top 8 richest people in the world are worth more than the bottom half of the world combined. Um, they're wealthy capitalists, right? They have the means of productions are not with everyone, right? The Amazon CEO um, Jeff Bezos owns the means of production in his factory, right? And that's allowed him to profit, right? Um, Etc. So there's great division of labor. And I guess the counterpoint to that would be like, yeah, they're very wealthy, but um, why should we be focusing on the gap between the rich and the poor? We should just focus on uh, this system's ability to lift so many people out of poverty, etc., which you can see in the videos below that I've included that I want you to watch. I guess what I want to get at is that um, although Marx was wrong about history appearing in different stages, so to speak, I doubt that if this capitalist system doesn't work out so well and people want radical change, that we're going to go into a idealized type of communist system. But I would say that he does offer the soundest critique of industrial industrial capitalism. a lot of his ideas are still repeated by politicians that might, for political purposes, never really um, embrace or characterize their ideas as Marxist. And Marx, for better or worse, had probably one of the biggest impacts on world history